A lot of us listen to podcasts. There are so many good ones, and they have audiences, some of them of hundreds and some of them thousands. This show has a listenership of 3 million people. Join it. With a combined experience of over 60 years together in paranormal research, these two supernatural adventurers, and that is what they are among the pioneers of the theory that UFOs, ghost and poltergeist phenomena, cryptoids, and other areas of paranormal are closely connected. They are joint authors of Behind the Paranormal, Everything You Know Is Wrong, and Behind the Paranormal 2, Bigfoot, Mothman, and Monsters You Never Heard Of. Paul is the author or co-author of another 10 books and one on paranormal and historical subjects. Paul Eno was one of the first paranormal investigators of the early 70s, something that began while he was studying for the priesthood. His early mentors included parapsychology pioneers, and these are legends in the field, Dr. Louisa Royn, Friar John J. Nicola, S.J., who was technical advisor on the film The Exorcist, and legendary first-generation ghost hunters Ed and Lorraine Warren. Paul graduated from 2 seminaries, but was expelled from a third due to his involvement in paranormal studies. Shame on you. He holds a PhD in philosophy, is an award-winning New England newspaper and magazine journalist, which includes 6 years as a news editor of the Providence Journal. Ben Eno, a 2014 graduate of Boston's distinguished Emerson College, is Paul's 26-year-old son, co-host, and partner in the paranormal. He joined his dad's adventures at the age of 13, holds a bachelor's degree in sound design and audio post-production, and works in film and interior design. Paul has appeared on the History Channel, Discovery, and Travel channels, and he and Ben have lectured all over America and in Europe, including one of my favorite corners of Europe, Suffolk, England. This brings us to the subject of their talk, which is Aliens and Exorcism: Why Do UFOs Turn Up in Possession Cases? I have to say, in my position as a speaker, as a friend of theirs, as the MC of this event, in putting together these introductions, our extraordinary speakers, this made me do a double take. While doing research for an upcoming book, Paul came upon a series of notes he hadn't looked at in more than 40 years, and in fact had completely forgotten about. They had something to do with memories he had worked very hard to bury, which was assisting a Catholic priest at exorcisms in a state hospital in New York in the mid-1970s. In doing so, Paul was astonished to read that 5 of the 7 exorcism subjects that they worked with had reported UFO and other experiences, including classic nighttime visitations, as would take place in many UFO abduction cases. At the time, the priest told Paul not to pay any attention to this. This talk is a deep look at the reasons for the apparent crossover phenomena that takes place in such situations. Without further ado, Paul and Ben Eno. Please welcome them.
You guys.
Thank you, Peter. We're going to do a time slip right now, back to 1973. How many people here were alive in 1973? All right, okay, that's not bad for a holiday weekend. You had ground beef was 73 cents a pound, but you were lucky if you could get gas. Remember the gas lines? Anybody was old enough to drive at the time? Telly Savalas, Kojak, just came on the air, famous detective show that many of you probably have never heard of, but Telly Savalas, Mr. Cool. Now, also in 1973, fluky things were going on in New Hampshire. Now, I don't know what it is with your police officers around here, but they have to be the luckiest ones in the country when it comes to UFO experiences. Things are always exciting. And yours truly, believe it or not, that's me, quite a bit less of me than there is today, I might add. I was involved in paranormal studies for several years before this, and my Roman Catholic Church superiors were not very pleased with that. That included my boss, Bishop John A. Marshall of the Diocese of Burlington, Vermont, who decided to send me to a seminary in the middle of absolutely nowhere in order to keep me out of mischief. It didn't work because he didn't figure on Father Lawrence Cotter and the Ogdensburg State Asylum for the Insane, otherwise known as St. Lawrence State Hospital. Now, I had been involved with, as Peter said in his introduction, some pretty well-known people in this field. Father John Nicola, Louisa Rhine, whose husband, of course, Dr. J.B. Rhine, these were the people who invented the term ESP. She did a lot of work on children with ESP, and they were really the founders of modern parapsychology in the 1930s. And of course, dear old Ed and Lorraine Warren here, that's me again, who I always laugh at the Conjuring films. Ed was kind of portly. Lorraine was very pretty, but they weren't these like dashing, dapper couple you see in the Conjuring films. But anyway, these are the people I was working with. And the second seminary faculty at that seminary I just showed you in the middle of nowhere, Wadhams Hall in Ogdensburg, New York, were very sympathetic to what I was doing. I was very surprised. But I don't know if they knew that Father Lawrence Cotter, who was the exorcist for the Diocese of Ogdensburg, took me under his wing. Now, he lived in the seminary, and he was rather mysterious. He had a very funny, kind of buzzy voice. But he knew all about me as soon as I got there. And I said, who is this, and what does he do? He didn't teach. He lived there. But he was the chaplain at Ogdensburg State Hospital. And he called me in during that first semester, and he said, he was kind of impressed with Ed and Lorraine Warren for some reason. And we had a couple of long talks. And eventually, he had me helping him with exorcisms at the state hospital. Because when you're in there with a patient and the doctors notice things flying off the shelves on the other side of the room, you cannot really chalk this up to the psychosis of the patient, things of this kind. So they would begin, that's when they called in Father Lawrence, because things were pretty fluky. He was the chaplain there, as I say, but he did more than that. So what is exorcism?
Well, an exorcism is a religious practice of expelling demons or any other spiritual entities. The act of driving out demons is sort of, biblically foretold. So if anybody here ever studied the Bible and you ever heard the tale of, was it the paralytic that? The insane person that was possessed that Christ then threw legion or whatever into a bunch of pigs and then sent them careening over a cliff. Although no one asked the pig farmer how he felt about it.
So these are all things what was recorded in the Bible became the practice even and the belief of most of the Christian churches. All right, but it's also a practice that is well known throughout the world. And one of the problems with this is that people very often get carried away with it. In Africa particularly, people have been known to, treat the people who are supposedly possessed violently to the point sometimes they have died. These are family members. It's very, very tragic. And I thought of this when I was involved in the exorcisms myself, because the thing was, if anybody knows us and has heard us speak before, we don't take any of this stuff at face value. There's something missing in a lot of these understandings. They aren't good enough to explain what we think the reality is. So moving along, the Roman Catholic ritual of exorcism is very institutionalized. A priest has to do it, and the priest has to have the permission of the local bishop. You can't just go in and start doing it, all right? So what we had here was, of course, this very ancient ritual, and of course, sometimes it was done in Latin. We always did it in English, and I shouldn't say I was just assisting. And again, when things would happen outside of the patient's control, physical control, that's when things would start to get suspicious. We would very often find that the patient not only was the center of what is generally known as poltergeist activity, the movement of objects by invisible means, they would have tremendous knowledge of foreign languages, of things they really had no way of knowing. They would have tremendous physical power at times. In one case of Barbara, which is going to be in the first chapter of my next book coming out next year, she kept floating out of the wheelchair, and the other assistant and I had to push her back down. We kind of got used to this. Now, in researching the first chapter of this book, I was, as Peter described, I was astonished to find something that I had absolutely forgotten. As Peter said, 5 of the 7 people that Father Lawrence exorcised were having UFO experiences. And you can see my notes. Now, I was not allowed to take notes at the hospital. I never really found out why, but I'd get back to the seminary, and my handwriting is just as bad as it is today, so I would type it out.
I was going to say, like, that's pretty good handwriting.
Thank you, Ben. Always nice to get a compliment from your son.
Yes.
So, but again, here again, here's Barbara, this one in the yellow. Barbara, several times in 1971 and 1972, and again in June this year, this is 1973, saw little gray figures by her bed, but does not remember anything more. She said there were bright lights in the sky over the river, that's the St. Lawrence River, 3 nights before each of these events. Father Carter, said that he sometimes hears this, and sometimes people report different kinds of animals or creatures. But especially with mental patients, he does not put much stock in the stories. In other words, these people were patients in a state hospital, so they were officially nuts anyway. So he essentially said, don't pay any attention to it. I wish we had. And here's, of course, another one. There was a patient named John. This is actually a place in New York State, not too far away, where there was a landing reported in that period. I talked to John today. He claims he saw, I think that was 3 dark figures in his bedroom and a flying saucer. Some kind of strange light landed in a field. This is along Route 10. That's a highway outside Madrid, as they pronounce New York. There does not seem to be much to this, and not to be distracted by this. That's what the priest said. Don't be distracted by it. Well, we should have been. This was Barbara. This is taken actually several years after her exorcism. And a lot of these things did not end well. People think you go in and exorcise somebody, the demon, quote unquote, leaves, and that's really all there is to it. And one of the questions that arose, and I think I know what some of you may be thinking, and that's you're going to give the Christian line that all UFO experiences, all aliens are actually demons. No. It could be just the opposite. So I'm not, sort of carrying the party line here. So Barbara died of a drug overdose several years after this occurred. I graduated from the seminary in 74, certainly, and I was at St. Vladimir's, and no, I wasn't either. I was out of there in 75. I'm lucky I graduated, but I did. And Barbara was doing okay by that time. When we were dealing with her, she was emaciated. There were times, particularly during the first exorcism, this was done 3 times, that she was somehow just totally out of it. Of course, as I say, she was floating out of the chair, and Leonard, I did not know any more about him. We had to push her back down into the chair. At these exorcism sessions, there was a doctor, always present. There were 2 assistants, myself and Leonard, and there were 2 nurses, and plus Father Carter. We were not allowed to associate with one another outside of those rooms. People say, gee, how could people not find out about this in the general hospital population? Well, a lot of people did hear rumors. One of my friends here is from that area and said that there were a lot of strange stories about St. Lawrence State Hospital. That was not the 21st century. People didn't talk about things as much. They didn't want notoriety for this kind of thing. They were very embarrassed, particularly for a medical professional, particularly a doctor. They were very afraid of their reputations. They could ruin their careers just talking about this kind of thing. But everybody, I think, in a way, kind of knew what was going on because it just got too weird. So Barbara was not, and most of these people I found out later on, Father Carter had to go back and exorcise them again. And I think the reason for that was that I don't think it was what it appeared to be. I don't think we were doing the right thing. The theological understanding of demons was, I think, all wrong. And I think all we were doing was feeding it, like feeding a shark. Because what we believe, and Shane Searway is going to talk more about this tomorrow, was that these were not servants of Satan. These were life forms, parasitic life forms, that I have, in ensuing years, had physical contacts with and struggles with. And they were simply feeding right off the ritual of exorcism. Because what was it? In the exorcism prayer, there is the first part is a demand that the demon give its name. Now this comes from two instances in the gospel where Jesus demanded that the demon give its name. And so it got carried over into the ritual practice of the early church and then into the Catholic Church. And I said to Father Cotter, what makes you think this is its real name? And there's an old belief throughout humanity that if you have someone's name, you have control over them. You have a certain power over them. Why do you shake someone's hand as soon as you hear their name? Because that's a sign. The whole idea of waving and shaking the hand came from the practice, presumably, of showing someone you did not carry a weapon in your hand and that you were not a threat to them. So the whole thing, giving your name, shaking hands, showing an empty hand, it's a sign of no danger. I'm not going to hurt you. So when we had these name givings, how do you believe them? And he said, well, they're bound by the authority of Christ, of the church through the Christ and the ritual, not to lie. So I know that really wasn't good enough for me. So I was 21 years old. Who's going to listen to me? So that was what he said. But during her exorcism, there was a moment when he demanded the name. It didn't give the name right away, but then it went into one of the exorcisms. There were 3 exorcism prayers, very belligerent, expressing authority. I felt this thing getting stronger. I don't know why nobody else felt it. This is why I ran this lecture past the KRI group in Stratham a few months ago, because to see if I could get through it emotionally. As Peter said, I worked very hard to bury these memories. And the background of what I'm going to tell you next was in 1961, when I was 7 years old and was witness to my father's suicide. Obviously, or probably the most telling moment in my life. So I'm standing many years later, 1973, in this room with this priest who's doing an exorcism, and it gave its name, and this voice that was not this girl's, it was a low, vile voice. It said, Chal. I interpreted that as C-H-A-L-L, because that's what she said. Her guiding spirit was Chal, an Asian prince from all this baloney that they give you. And in my mind, when I heard it say Chal, I said, baloney. Just in my mind, just to myself. Somehow it heard me, and it came out, and, well, first of all, here's the background of Barbara's case, but it came out and said this. This is perfect Malay. Now, had this been in English, I would have lost it. The doctor had to look it up, because the doctor was recording all this. I don't know where all the recordings are. They might be in the Vatican, for all I know. This translates, I was there when your father committed suicide. I told him to do it. This thing said this to me. They wouldn't tell me what this meant until the end of the school year. And finally, Father Cotter sat me down and said, this is what this thing said. And I'm glad, if I had known it there, I just would have lost it. So if anybody asked me what was the most profound moment in almost 50 years of paranormal research, that was it. Hitting home, it knows just where to hit you. And it fed off that even afterwards, because even if I didn't know what it meant, it was incredible. So Barbara's case started out as many cases do, drug addiction, and we often would find that mental illness and addiction was intertwined with paranormal events. External phenomena, as we said, was common. Floating objects. During her case, as we were leading up to the exorcism prayers, there was pounding outside the window on the second floor. There were people, she had to be isolated in a private room because the other patients were disturbed by the fact that something was tearing her covers off her bed and stomping around the room. Ouija boards, bad stuff. Chal, an Asian prince who came through the Ouija board. This is classic. Alien encounters and possible abductions, and that's where we get into our connection here. Now again, I don't think this is because aliens are actually demons. It may be the opposite. Because when for example, in my own experience, all I can do is rely on my own experience. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think this is what is really happening. 1974 in Bridgeport, Connecticut, with Ed Lorraine Warren, I was working in a house with them on probably the best witness poltergeist case probably in history. William J. Hall, who unfortunately isn't here, he wrote an excellent book called The World's Most Haunted House. And he interviewed not only the surviving witnesses, including me, but many of the police officers who had been there. For example, and I've mentioned this in previous lectures, I apologize if you've heard it before. I was standing there in the kitchen of this little house in Bridgeport with 3 police officers from the city police department on my right, 3 firefighters on my left, and we all saw a refrigerator pick itself up very gently, lower itself back down. I was hit in the leg by a flying television set. Things went on and on and on for 3 days, and the Warrens, we were waiting for an exorcism to be, permission for an exorcism from the Bishop of Bridgeport, which never came. There was a priest involved and all this sort of thing. It's all in the book, or it's in books I've written too. So when these things manifested to me, it was the Monday night of the case. We'd been there already for more than 24 hours. The Warrens were off to do some kind of a TV show. I was in the house alone with the family, which was the little girl named Marcy, the parents, a reporter from the Bridgeport Post, John Sopko, and one of the neighbors. 4 things came out of the kitchen, came down the hallway. You could see like these gauzy structures. One of them stood in front of me. I knew it was after the little girl, and this really brought things into clarity for me as far as these parasitical entities are concerned. Because this, as I got angrier and more annoyed, it fed on it. It got stronger. I pushed against it. It was right in front of me. Because that was an instinctive move. You push against something that's threatening you. It pushed back. This is supposed to be a spirit, right? Doesn't have bones, doesn't have flesh. This thing did, except you could barely see it. It totally blew away any remaining old ideas I had. It got around me and threw Marcy across the room. But here's the connection. This thing was utterly alien. I can't think of a better word for it.
I think we have to remember our ancient Greek, where the word alien came from. So in Greek society, they believed that there were, you had foreigners who were basically other Greeks. So if you were from Athens, you considered, Spartans like foreigners and barbarians. But anyone who was from outside Greece was considered alien, quote unquote, which just meant, someone utterly foreign. I think, in English, everything sort of has a singular meaning. Like how, in other languages, there's multiple words for love, when we just have one here. Like, you express the word love for, I love this building, but you use that same word to express love for another human being, which is dumb. English is a stupid language.
Tell us what you really think, Ben.
So keep in mind that we like to use singular words to describe many things, which we have a word for that, which is synonym. So we have a word that is alien that we think, instantly, all right, little green men, big heads, round eyes, small mouths, when really we should be thinking something utterly outside of our understanding.
Now, Ben, you have encountered with me in later years, since you joined our adventurous little band of 2 here, these parasites as well.
Oh, yeah, unfortunately.
Do you feel the same way, that these are alien creatures?
Oh, yeah.
And so we put labels on things according to what we understand, which isn't much.
It's all about perspective. If you walk into a field and see a glowing figure with a saucer above it, aha, an extraterrestrial. Or you see that same glowing figure inside of a house, you say, aha, a ghost. It's all perspective.
Yeah. So these were alien beings, and I think perhaps we need to broaden our definition of alien to go beyond something from another planet. And of course, then we got into the idea of multiple worlds, and that really gave some depth to it. But these are the kinds of things that caused a lot of the problems in the exorcisms we dealt with. And again, these things, and then she was just floating. We got used to it. Finally, in the final exorcism prayer, we tied her. The nurses tied Barbara to the wheelchair with soft things that wouldn't hurt her, and I was afraid the whole thing would flood, but it didn't, so that was good. Of course, here's the shot of the old hospital. It is still, most of the buildings are still there. It is still a psychiatric center. But by the place closed in 1983, and by that time anyway, inpatients at these hospitals were very unusual. Not very unusual, but there were far fewer than there were today because the states couldn't afford it. So they filled people's pockets full of antipsychotic drugs, and off they went, and they became homeless. So, very bad situation. And of course, the Poltergeist case in November of '74, which we just described. That's Marcy, the little girl. And of course, the Warrens coming out of the house, and Father Bill Charbonneau, all of whom have passed away except Lorraine Warren, who's in her 90s. It was funny, the crowds outside that house were estimated anywhere from 2,000 to 10,000. And the people expected, so the news media were, but they expected Father Bill Charbonneau or myself to come flying out the window like the priest did in The Exorcist. I mean, The Exorcist. So fortunately, that didn't happen. It's not how it works. And again, here is the sort of description of these things. And this is what they look like. This is what they felt like to me, almost bird-like. Now, I'm not an anatomist or a biologist, but that's what it felt like. And here's where Marcy and I were standing. We were the 10-year-old kid. She loved to play Monopoly for some reason, and we started to say a prayer, and these things didn't have any effect. I think that in the exorcisms that I witnessed, these things would play along, so that you would continue. I don't think their theology is anything like ours. These creatures, there are about 9 different species of them. They have a culture. They seem to have leadership. And it's really quite disconcerting when you deal with these things, which we believe are multiversal creatures. They reach into different parallel worlds, which is good physics today. And we've seen them operating in Vermont. We had one feeding off a murder that was taking place in one world. And there was only one. And when he couldn't get enough to eat, he'd go into we call this the haunted policeman of Vermont. He would go into the downstairs apartment where the police officer lived and wait for them to fight, he and his fiancée. And he said, whenever we would fight, we would see the thing. And Ben got a photograph of it.
It's a once-in-a-lifetime picture, and I'm very proud of it.
Well, this was one of your first cases. I was afraid to show it to you. And then he says, oh, it looks like one of the Black Riders from Lord of the Rings. That's cool, Dad.
13-year-old Ben thought it was pretty cool.
Yeah. All right. And, of course, somehow I managed to graduate from Wadham's Hall. This is a hooting ceremony. It's my poor, long-suffering mother. And, of course, we look back through history, and everything that I was seeing at St. Lawrence State Hospital and in these cases, in Bridgeport, was nothing new to the human experience. These are 30,000-year-old cave paintings from Australia. You can see alien-like figures. You can see there are some that look almost like Bigfoot, this kind of thing. Throughout history, too, you've got the biblical themes with strange things in the sky. Maybe it's something else, but it doesn't look like it to me. Winged creatures, various gods. And this, History Channel, aliens, our assumptions. Now, of course, we believe they may be here to study us, and that's entirely possible. What we're suggesting is that not all aliens, in a broad sense, are from other planets. They may be from other planets, but they don't have to travel to get here. In other words, they may be what physicists describe as brains, B-R-A-N-E-S, or membranes, between parallel worlds. What does quantum physics suggest? That all possibilities exist in concrete reality somewhere or somewhen in the multiverse. In other words, at some point, any of you might have been killed in the crash of a UFO 30,000 years ago. There are many worlds in which you were never born. There are many worlds in which you have already died. And if it's a close parallel world with a very similar set of the laws of physics, which is each one may have different laws of physics, they say, then your people may see you skipping down the street 2 weeks after your funeral. Aha, a ghost. It's not a ghost, it's you. And we think this is the beginning to understanding a lot of the paranormal phenomena. Aliens, there's another assumption, aliens are not connected with demons, ghosts, or any other area of the paranormal. Apparently not. And the religious proscription, all aliens and the whole paranormal for that matter, is demonic. It's a very easy answer to a very difficult problem. I have some very religious relatives who swear by this. But as I say, as I think I've maybe shown, the demons the aliens may actually be demons. I should say the demons may actually be aliens, you know. But again, these are our narrow terms. We have different kinds of aliens. This is from the 1940s onward. Extraterrestrial life has to be like us, therefore we look for life that is life as we know it. What about life as we don't know it? Carl Sagan himself, the great scientist and a novelist and just about everything else, speculated about plasma-based life forms. In the 1960s and 70s, volcanic vents were discovered on the ocean floor that were not, the biology was not powered by the sun. We assumed all biology on this planet is powered by the sun, and these things lived on what to us would be poisonous sulfuric gases. And yet it was an entirely separate ecosystem.
What was it that Jeff Goldblum said in Jurassic Park? Life finds a way.
Life finds a way.
There we go.
Sure does. We didn't have to leave our planet to find alien life. So again, demons, we assume demons are evil. The ones I've run into, I think are entirely neutral. They're just trying to eat. They're just trying to eat. They, I think, are extremely intelligent, most of them. The lower shelf ones are rather, I'm not going to say dumb, but two-dimensional in their thinking. We had one in New York City, and I can't tell you the name of the person because she's a very famous artist. 25 years, she had an attachment, as you might say, a parasitical entity of the brat, I call them brats, the lowest level. They're two-dimensional thinkers. They act like spoiled children. It would throw her down the stairs, do all these things, create terrible smells in her apartment, and it was afraid to separate itself from her. It was very alien, but it didn't know where to go or what to do if it separated from the host. And we find this is a really fascinating tendency among parasites, that the longer they spend in our world or attached to one of us, the more they forget their own origins. It's fascinating. So again, parasites that we think are demons or aliens, and really may in a way be both. The parasites certainly fill the role of demons. They certainly act like what we would say, but their theology I just don't believe is the same. They will react to the cross if the people believe in the cross. You know, they will react to a teddy bear if a child has a great protective relationship with the teddy bear. I once got rid of the worst parasite I ever dealt with by using a joke book. All right, it had pretty much, there were 6 of them. This is in Connecticut in '79. Pretty much had worn itself out. And I went in with the woman and her daughter, and we yucked it up. We had a great time. A fellow came, a friend of mine who was now a Roman Catholic priest in the Archdiocese of Hartford. The thing was never seen or heard from again. So it all depends on the case, but I don't believe have our theology. They don't believe in God the way we do.
Well, it's like Carl Jung's idea of archetypes, you know. The human race has had archetypes all throughout its entire history, you know, like, you know, the star, pentagram, things like that. Or even like, you know, if you walk outside and you see a red hexagon, you're like, oh, cool, I got to stop. But it doesn't necessarily say stop on it. You know, it's these symbols that we attach some sort of meaning to over, you know, millennia that sort of give itself power. It's like, you know, voodoo lords will say, oh, well, it doesn't matter. Like, someone will try and, like, turn you into a zombie or something, which, you know, they use some sort of chemical powder that will turn you into zombies.
I actually talked to an elder, a voodoo priest in Haiti, who told me just how they do that. It's all chemical. But in any case, there are some very chilling and sobering questions that arise from the activities of these parasites. Is it possible, and this is becoming kind of an opinion around, I'm thinking of our friend Nick Redfern, who wrote the foreword for my next book and just wrote a book on this. Is it possible that we are a farm planet and that we are the cattle? These things seem to push our buttons. They learn about us. And you know, not to get nuts here, but there is all kinds of evidence that we were messed with. I'm sure a lot of people here watching Ancient Aliens. Well, when you look at the actual genetic evidence that came up in 2004, when the human genome was mapped completely for the first time, there were 223 genes that shouldn't be there if evolution as we understand it is correct. The implication is that someone or something put them there. So this is really not within the purview of this lecture, but these are things that we can think about. I will hasten to add that I have run into many very positive and helpful entities, people, non-people, whatever, who, you know, I don't believe they're spirits, because actually the notion of spirits is very difficult because it's not possible under the laws of physics for that sort of thing to exist, in our world anyway. But in other worlds, who knows? So again, alien, parasite, or both. These are some interesting pictures. Were taken at the sites of landings of UFOs. I took this one myself, and of course, if it was a little darker, you could see the arms and things here. But this was not an alien situation. This was not an exorcism or a parasite situation. This was in an attic in Cheektowaga, New York, and it was in 1989. And I was able to communicate, and I hesitate to do this because it sounds like I'm doing the medium thing, and I wasn't. These people were convinced it was a ghost in their attic stomping around and making noise, this sort of thing. But I got there, and I used a technique that I developed at St. Lawrence State Hospital, which I use very rarely because it's very dangerous, I think. I simply got into a meditative state and just to see who was there. I didn't make, I think the Ouija board thing and all is very dangerous. You're using a sledgehammer technique to contact something that may be very dangerous. But in this meditation technique, sometimes it takes several days of hours of meditation. But in this particular case, this one that looked like these others was a bear-like figure from a parallel reality, an alien, if you will, that was very positive, and the sense of nobility flowing from this being was incredible. It was very good in our sense. It spoke a very strange form of Latin because not everything out there speaks English. And the very strange form of Latin, fortunately I had studied 5 years of it in the Catholic seminary, the case endings were very odd, and it took 3 days to get through this conversation. Not the whole 3 days, but hours at a time. It said, if I got it right, that it was on a quest. It had been sent by a goddess whose name I never caught. It was being sent on a quest to a place called Renthusia, which I'd never heard of since.
Well, isn't it more of an idea than a place?
I don't know.
Well, because the way that it's conjugated, it sounds more like an idea than a place. Or like a state of being.
I got the
or
impression
something.
it was a place.
Okay, fair
Although
enough.
you could be right, I don't know. But again, there are uncertainties here. And as I say, if I got through the goofy Latin, that's what it said. After the conversation was over, and there were many things I didn't understand, it disappeared, was never seen again. But again, the thing that really struck me was not so much the conversation as the feeling of goodness from this creature. And I don't think it was an angel or anything. It was a warrior. There was some indication that there would be some sort of struggle at the end. And this goddess was very positive. I don't know what the goddess was or who. But these are things that really started to throw me for a loop. And this was not anything I'd ever heard in any paranormal literature before. But it looked kind of like these. And I think that the reason it comes through looking like this is because what are we looking through? We're looking through the brains or membranes of parallel realities, which are what? Electromagnetic energy charged with plasma, probably. At least that's what it looks like.
Or it's just hanging around in light spectrum we can't quite see.
That too, yeah. So again, and some are more in our world than others, and so maybe that's it. This one I took in 1998 in a real genuine parasite case in Rhode Island, and it was lining people up to be a hot lunch. It was after the woman in the house. There were two of them, two parasites, and then when we taught the woman to think positive, cut off the food supply by what do we call it? The Peter Pan theory, right? Yeah.
Think happy thoughts.
Exactly. It works. Love. Simple as that.
Who would have thought?
Yeah, exactly. And then it went after the little girl in the house, but they knew what to do by that time. This is the activity. And of course, there's the abduction problem. And here's this Bud Hopkins. This is, you know who, and you were, what, it was 03.
There's no beard and there's hair. I don't think anybody knows who
No,
that
nobody
is.
would know. Total anonymity. And Ben's older brother, and of course myself and Bud Hopkins. And for those of you who don't know who Bud Hopkins was, he was the leading abduction researcher of his day, very, very pioneering fellow. Peter Robbins was a dear friend of his, and Peter just tells some wonderful stories about him. I don't know if Peter's here, but it's just, I'm always moved by this. And now, one of the things that Bud and I did on this case, this is in West Virginia, we found some time to sit down, and he showed me his album of wounds to people's bodies who were abducted. and the gouges and the various things. And I said, Bud, this is very similar to a lot of things I see in poltergeist cases. And I said, wow, what could this mean? I mean, is there a connection? And unfortunately, he was diagnosed with cancer shortly thereafter, and we were unable to do any work together as we had planned. But I'd be very curious to see what the crossover points might have been between abductions and poltergeists. And here are some examples. Poltergeist cases, and many thanks to Kathy Martin for lending us these photographs. And of course, where do you draw the line? And Kathy and I and Ben and Denise Stoner and a few other people often talk about these crossover phenomena. Do our labels really mean anything? Where does the poltergeist end? Where does the parasite end? Where does the alien begin? What exactly is going on during abduction phenomena? Are we just pinning labels on it that we understand? So we're really just at square one. And again, as Ben said, context and perception. So again, as he said, if you see this thing in your house, aha, a ghost. And if you see it outside, then, aha, an alien, right? So the multiple worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is the official name of the whole idea of the multiverse, implies that every life form exists somewhere or somewhen. We often will joke, sometimes on our Halloween show, that the great pumpkin must actually exist, or something like it, somewhere or somewhen, or Charles Schulz, the cartoonist, would never have been able to think of it. Our imaginations, our memories, may very well come from parallel lives we are living. Why is it that Mozart was able to sit down at the age of 4 and write brilliant piano concerti? He even performed before kings and the popes and people at the behest of his father. But how can a 4-year-old do that? Maybe he was in touch where he already is. There is no past, no future, and Einstein proved that in 1952, where he already is a brilliant composer. He's in touch with a parallel life where that's going on. We often will say, from our point of view, a past life, reincarnation. But that really doesn't hold water because of Einstein's theory of relativity. There is no past, there is no future. It's all a function of our consciousness.
It's all happening simultaneously.
Exactly. All things that could possibly happen are happening simultaneously. To us, we could be wrong, but that explains ghosts, ESP, psychic phenomena, aliens, how UFOs come and go, regardless of where they're coming from or what they are. So again, it's the first day of school, we believe. And these are all people who thought about this before we did. And of course, probably the greatest of these thinkers, Jacques Vallée, who is still with us from France, and he began to say that, maybe Bigfoot and some of these other creatures are coming and going from parallel worlds. Maybe UFOs are doing the same thing. Brad Steiger convinced John Keel that Bigfoot was connected with UFOs because of parallel worlds. Now, John Keel is not with us. Brad Steiger just passed recently, or translated, as we say, because death really has no meaning. And I must say I'm very honored to be included in his last book, which came out just really on the cusp of his death, and talking about this very thing. A very simplistic idea of the multiverse. But when you're playing the bubble thing, Ben.
Play the bubble thing.
People like that.
Yes. So picture you go to the bathroom, you wash your hands, hopefully with soap and water. So, if you observe the bubbles in the sink, you'll notice that some bubbles grow, some bubbles pop, some bubbles, go in and get absorbed by other bubbles, and, some bubbles just get, pass through other bubbles as well. So essentially, this is what we're dealing with. We're all existing in all of these bubbles that are constantly interacting with each other. On a micro scale, right? You put down your keys, come into your house, you turn around, keys are gone. You're just like, oh, well, it's just one of those things. Well, you just passed through a world where somewhere, somewhen, those keys don't exist. You'll find them later in a different part of the house that you hadn't even been in yet. Or you'll put down your hat's gone. Put down your bag's gone. You're driving down the street one day and there's a building there that wasn't there yesterday. Or it's painted a different color and they're like, oh, what do you mean? It's always been red. That kind of thing.
People have actually written into our show with reports like that.
Exactly. So, this is just all stuff that's happening all the time, but we kind of dismiss as, oh, it's just one of those things.
So this gets back to, how did this parasite know about my father? Well, they seem to be multiversal creatures who come from worlds where the laws of physics are such that they can see into other worlds. This thing could dial up my memories, not by tapping into me, but by tapping into the multiverse. That's what I believe anyway. So in a way, it may have been there when I was a terrified 7-year-old kid on a cold January day in 1961. Maybe it was there. It dialed in because it's all simultaneous. Einstein essentially said that all things exist simultaneously. So I think we may be on the cusp of an entirely new understanding of the paranormal, never mind aliens. So there we are. More accurately from that previous diagram, this is more what it probably is actually like. These are maybe nanoseconds in our lives, all separate worlds, okay? And I'll give you an example of how that might work. If habits are interesting because the more you do something, the more worlds it is taking place in. For example, Willimantic, Connecticut, 1999. I was on this TV show with John Zaffis, who some of you may have heard, nephew of Ed and Lorraine Warren. And someone called in and said, we have these weird footsteps coming down our steps every morning and then again in the evening. So I went to the house. I spent 2 days there. I slept over on the couch. And sure enough, I heard these footsteps. So on a hunch, and I recorded it. And it recorded, which doesn't always happen. So I said to the man who had reported this, I said, go on upstairs and come down the stairs. And he did. And then when I was on the couch, I listened to it as he came down the stairs in the morning. It was exactly the same. And it was exactly the same on the recording. I believe it was him coming down the stairs in a parallel reality, and it was because of the habits. He did it every single day, sometimes more than once, and it was recorded in world after world after world after world, and there it was. That was, the ghost was him. And we've seen this time and time and time again. But we don't know about this, so it's got to be some kind of spirit, right? So what some aliens and demons might actually be, again, parasitic life forms living between worlds. Case in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania in 2004. There were some girls who were roommates in an apartment having all kinds of problems with what they believed were spirits. They were hearing voices. The voices would attack them personally. There were seemingly ghosts. And when all was said and done, the ghosts were people living in the house. This was my interpretation. Were ghosts living in the house in a parallel world, thinking the girls were ghosts haunting them. Why? Because they would see them across the membranes, and they would look all gauzy or glowing or whatever, and they wouldn't really hear things. And the parasite was living off a murder that had actually taken place in the backyard, and then when it couldn't get enough to eat from that, it was coming in and harassing the girls and the quote-unquote ghosts. So the thing was like an octopus reaching into 3 different worlds, feeding on negative stuff. That's how it seemed to work. And just as soon as the girls realized, as soon as you get their number, they run. Not the girls, the parasites. So taught them again, positive thinking, the Peter Pan theory, and sure enough, it ended. The food supply was cut off. They went out in the yard, they positive energy, meditated. They weren't religious, so we didn't get into the holy water or anything like that. But it did work. Positive energy cuts off the food supply. And again, just part of nature. As our good friend Mark D'Antonio would say, it's undiscovered science. And about 9 different species, ranging from the wise to the brats. The wise I often run into. I ran into one of them in 1998 and several times since then. But this one had the woman in the house utterly convinced that it was a lover from a former life. All right? And the woman would actually put somebody in the room with her and witness this. She would get up at night and she would feel hands around her neck, and she'd sit up in bed, and we actually saw this. There would be red marks as of hands. How does a spirit do that? Doesn't, we don't think. So this thing was playing her like a bass fiddle, as we would say, just as things like it were playing us during the exorcisms. And we worked it around, and she realized this was not what was happening. It wasn't a lover, it was a parasite. Positive thinking again, got rid of it. She married a really good Native American shaman. That didn't hurt either. So it never had any more problems. They're very intelligent. They quickly learn what buttons to push. One of the greatest examples of parasites as aliens and as active among us is the famous Bell Witch case of 1817 to 1821 in Robertson County, Tennessee. Most of you may have heard of that. It's considered the best documented poltergeist case, perhaps outside of the Bridgeport case, in American history anyway. It began in the Bell family in 1817. The young girl was harassed by some sort of thing they believed was a spirit, and it eventually grew because it got all kinds of food, so to speak, because there's I was able to see some primary sources on this. There was sexual abuse going on in this family by the father against the daughter, and that rings the dinner bell for parasites. That was getting worse, and finally the thing eventually turned against the father, and it's considered popularly as the only time a spirit actually killed anybody. Now that's not what happened. He was very sick at the end anyway. But as it got more recognition, it got stronger, and it was able to wander geographically beyond the house. There were actually 4 of them. It would get to the point where people would hear about this, come to the house to see these antics. The thing would listen, apparently, somehow to every, maybe like this knew about my father, but they would repeat word for word every sermon in every church in Robertson County. People thought that was hilarious. It would tell very funny jokes. It would make fun of certain people, and it would like certain other people. It eventually got to the point where it was so strong it would go around the county and give agricultural advice.
Send people on treasure hunts.
Matchmake. And of course, usually it would come to nothing or would not be a very positive outcome. This has tribal God written all over it. What was it that, if you go to the British Museum or pretty much any museum, and you look at the ancient gods people used to worship in, anywhere, they weren't very appetizing, right? Later on, you had more or less decent folks like Isis and Osiris, or some of these others later on. But why would people worship such loveless gods as ones that demanded human sacrifice? Maybe because they were parasites, making people think they had no choice. Had this, in Tennessee, had this not been a 19th century Protestant community, these things might very well have taken over. And they almost did. So, perfect example, I think, of aliens/parasites active in human life. And again, the very chilling question, are we cattle? So again, what is demonic possession? What were we trying to exorcise? Where do you take what we've just said into this intimately ferocious personal relationship? Well, we believe that, and I believe what I was seeing at the time, was not the thing coming over and taking over a person's complete personality and mind. I've always found that the person has to tacitly agree for this to occur. Do you remember from the story Dracula? Count Dracula's down there in the castle, and he says to Jonathan Harker in the story, enter of your own free will. In other words, I can't force you to commit it, but if you do, you're done for, you're mine. That's an old tradition in human belief. And what is folklore? What is myth? They're the vessels of the memory of the human race. So the idea that you have to voluntarily do this, or let it in, is very interesting. The little girl Marcy, and many other people in poltergeist cases that are terrifying everyone else, sometimes are very happy for the attention they're getting. They like being the center of attention. They develop a bond sometimes with the parasite. This is what happens in what we call possession cases, I believe. The woman in the house who thought the parasite was her lover from a former life was beginning to develop such a bond. Had we not gone in and stopped it, it might have ended up in a possession case. But again, it's more a cooperation than a possession, at least that's what I saw, with the thing feeding on the thing that was supposed to be the remedy.
Also an obsession.
Obsession as well, yeah. That's one of the steps. And the whole poltergeist thing, parapsychologists will tell you, well, it's the person, almost like a thought form, is a person going through great trauma will project this energy and it starts to throw furniture around. I don't believe that at all. I think it's all these parasites. So again, employing the principle that all possibilities actually exist in concrete reality somewhere, possession is a multiversal intersect point where the two versions of ourselves temporarily become one. What does that mean? This idea of parallel lives is totally indiscriminate. There are many versions of you. There are many versions of all of us. And when you get down to it, there is a complete unity. Forget the island theory. And we talked about this many times, but the island theory is the idea. Can you explain it?
So essentially that we are all self-contained beings, like hanging out in our own sort of worlds, and nothing we do affects anybody else. And you can blame Rene Descartes for that, because he's the worst thing to happen to philosophy in the last 500 years.
Ben's favorite philosopher.
Well, he's terrible. To be completely frank, he came up with the idea of dualism, right? So like his whole thing was, humans are machines that happen to have, spirits or whatever driving them, right? So like that whole idea stemmed a lot of modern beliefs like nihilism and such like that, because it sort of paved the way for materialism. Essentially that, there's a spirit world and a material world, that's it. That's all you get. And they're both completely separate and they don't interact whatsoever, which is, not true whatsoever, because it's all connected, right? So if that was true, then how come, quote-unquote spirits do material things, right? So like one of my favorite things that I think is kind of funny, garden variety, like, ghost hunters will throw down like flour or something on the floor and they're like, oh, look, there's footprints. A spirit must be here. The logic of that just makes no sense, because how could a spirit have footprints, right? So anyway, getting back to the point. So the point being that if we do share this existence with everybody and everything, of course we would merge at some points in time, right? It's like finishing each other's sentences, because somewhere, somewhen, you are that same person saying that sentence.
So the point really being that in a possession case, the parasite finds where it is you in a parallel reality and makes a conjunction.
With your permission, of course.
With your permission. That's essentially what we think it is. And the time cop just arrived, so I think we better kind of hurry it along. So in Barbara's possession case, she wasn't taken over by a servant of Satan. She bonded with Chal, a parasite alien in every sense, save for one thing. It was an aspect of her own multiversal self. It was an independent being, but it was her too. So these are things to think about. And we don't have, here's a good one. We don't have time to really get into flap areas now. However, I don't know if this is a parasite, but there was a multiversal creature of some kind in an area where we have been researching for many years, and the thing seemed to appear on a security camera in an area where houses were being broken into, UFOs seen, Bigfoot, you name it, but houses were being broken into and nothing was stolen. This came out of the security camera. You can tell me what this is, I'd be grateful. Because the blue beam phenomenon, how did all these get in here? They weren't supposed to be. So again, the question, are governments or whoever working with aliens/parasites? There is a theory that they are. Wouldn't we love to weaponize the paranormal? Wouldn't parasites get a lot of juice from pumping up government officials? And again, not to get nuts here, not to get totally paranoid, but I think this is a real possibility. Dangling the notion of power before people is an old trait that parasites are pretty much known for, at least in our book. And again, what do good and bad actually mean? Nothing in the paranormal is what it appears to be, and the danger of wishful thinking is something we all have to avoid. Maybe none of this is true, maybe it's all true. How do we tell them apart? Maybe we don't. You can put that in your pipes and smoke it, as we used to say, and see what you come up with in your own life. But again, we're all kind of in this together, and we're all prey for these things. I think we have, such as perhaps that bear-like creature I talked about before, perhaps we have a lot of friends out there. I think we have more friends than we have enemies. And they themselves might be enemies of the parasites. The wars of the gods, from all the old stories, and from the Indian Mahabharata all the way through the legends, even the Bible, the wars between Satan and God,
the
Lucifer,
Epic of Gilgamesh, stuff like that.
Epic of Gilgamesh. Maybe those are based on something that really happened. Maybe the gods were people from somewhere or somewhen else who fought each other, maybe to protect us, maybe to hurt us. These are all possibilities. So we get into some of this stuff in our books, but again, it's the first day of school. This is Stella Lansing. She was from Massachusetts. She'd take pictures with an ordinary camera, and strange people would come out in them. She was known for this, and maybe it was some kind of phenomenon that had to do with the multiverse. But just to wrap it up, again, nothing is what it appears to be. Everything you know is wrong, and it's the first day of school. So whenever we think we know everything, we don't. And a little bit of shameless self-promotion. Some of our books have absolutely no interest in anyone here, probably, but We have the others, and of course, we're almost out of these, and we will take orders if we get down to the last one. This seems to be really popular at this conference. And next year's book, we don't know what the cover is going to look like yet. It's up to the publisher.
I hope it's that big question mark.
Well, yeah, that would really sell. And that's our radio show. You can listen to it anytime. It's Providence, Boston, so you might not pick it up here, but you can always get it on the website. And there are over 800 hours archived on our website, all free, including our 4.5 years on CBS Radio. So I'm hoarse, I'm tired, and I'm freaked because of what I just said. So thank you all very much.